Tibet, an exotic and mysterious land that fascinated intrepid adventurers and armchair travelers alike. What is it about Tibet that is so alluring? Is it the beauty of the arid plateau and the majestic Himalayas? Is it the colourful rituals and bizarre practices? Is it the plight of Tibetan refugees that could inspire the righteous or those eager to look righteous and heroic? Since foreigners are attracted to Tibet for different reasons, can Tibet manifest itself in different forms to different people? Can the Tibet that is known to Tibetans be different from the Tibet that so many Westerners admire? Hi guys, welcome to my channel. This book is very aptly entitled Virtual Tibet. I bought it at Pilgrims Book House a couple of years ago when I was in Kathmandu. In this video, I'm not just going to do a review of the book, I'm also going to talk about the subject. Foreigners' dreamy fascination with a place they actually don't know about. Unlike most books on Tibet that marvel at Tibetan art, culture and Buddhism or champion the political causes, this book takes a sober, balanced and well-informed view of Westerners' fascination with a Tibet that only exists in their minds. First, a little history. At the end of the 7th century, King Songtsen Gampo of the Yalung dynasty unified disparate tribes on the plateau and established a capital city in Lhasa. A Tibetan empire was formed north of the Himalayas, extending east to present-day Sichuan province, northeast to Qinghai, and west to Central Asia. Now, King Songtsen had two wives, Nepalese Princess Brikuti and on his right side, and Princess Wencheng on his left. Now, both princesses are believed to have brought Buddhism into Tibet. By the middle of the 9th century, the Tibetan Empire had lost its military power and only spiritual leaders remained. Unable to defend itself, Tibet allied itself with the Mongols. It was a synergistic relationship. The Mongols provided security and the Tibetans provided spiritual fulfillment. In 1578, Mongolian Prince Altan Khan dubbed Tibet's spiritual leader Dalai Lama, Ocean of Wisdom. Tibet remained a client state under the Mongols after Kublai Khan conquered China, but things got a little complicated after the Yuan dynasty was toppled by the Ming dynasty. Now, Ming's Han Chinese folks had little interest in Tibetan Buddhism and pretty much left cold, barren and hostile Tibet alone. Now, even though they lost control of China, the Mongols were still a force to be reckoned with. In 1662, the Manchus, a Central Asian tribe which adopted Tibetan Buddhism, conquered China. Mongols and Manchus fought over Tibet, which was finally liberated when the 7th Dalai Lama accepted help from the Manchu army. In 1721, Qing Emperor Kangxi declared Tibet a vassal state of the Qing Empire. Tibetans thanked the Qing dynasty for liberating the territory from the Mongols. China's territory was largest under the Manchus, who banned sea travel and resisted foreign trade. Manchu garrisons in Tibet ensured that Westerners in India did not try to sneak into Tibet across the Himalayas. 1903 saw the expansion of the Russian Empire in Central Asia, and the Qing dynasty was in decline. British forces were initially tasked to define and hold the Tibetan border at Sikkim. However, supported by Bhutan, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Younghusband went way beyond instructions from his superiors and invaded Tibet, pushing all the way to Lhasa. In 1911, the Qing dynasty was no more and Tibet achieved de facto independence after signing a peace treaty with Britain. In 1949, the CCP defeated the KMT in a civil war. the very next year, the PLA crossed into Tibet from Yunnan and began its decades of occupation. Tibet was made to sign a 17-point agreement after the UN rejected Tibet's appeals to condemn China's invasion. The autonomy that the Chinese government granted turned out to be a scam. The Chinese authorities deemed Tibet to be backward and proceeded to modernize Tibet rapidly. An uprising occurred in Lhasa in 1959. The Dalai Lama fled to Dharamsala, India, and set up a government in exile over there. Many Tibetans would follow the Dalai Lama's footsteps, braving hypoxia and frostbite to cross Himalayan passes into India or Nepal. Refugee camps became a gold mine for journalists. Stories from refugees fired the imagination of the romantics. Western liberals jumped on the bandwagon, and there was virtually an endless scope for boycott, condemnation, worship, and virtue signaling. Now, even though the concept of Shangri-La could be dated to James Hilton's Lost Horizon during World War II, Tibet became a favorite subject for Hollywood in the 1990s, just as slavery was a hot topic in the 1970s and the 1980s. Stunning landscapes, haunting sounds, exotic costumes, mystical rituals, and bizarre practices. Meditation retreats conducted by men in robes attract hordes of Westerners who seem to have found a new faith. The fans went crazy. I once got cyber-bullied when I questioned the effectiveness of Tibetan healing arts in a land where the life expectancy was dismally poor before the advent of modern medicine. Make no mistake, the attraction of Tibet was phenomenal. How did we get here? A lot of it has to do with the Dalai Lama's image of non-violence, compassion, humility, and also His Holiness' magnetic personality. Now, the opposing side is an arrogant, no-nonsense authoritarian regime that censors all news and pursues GDP at all costs. Hollywood seized the opportunity to make movies that fans of Tibet would love. And to make successful movies, Hollywood needs to simplify the narrative for its audience. Now, the first major big-budget film was 7 Years in Tibet, starring Brad Pitt. It was a bold and ambitious venture. The location of the shoot had to be changed because the Indian government changed its mind about letting the filming crew shoot in Ladakh after the Chinese government threatened to cut the power supply to the state. In the end, the film was shot in several locations, mainly Argentina and a bit of it in Canada. It's also rumored that about 20 minutes of the footage was secretly shot inside the forbidden land of Tibet itself. The movie is based on a book telling the true story of Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harrier and his stay in Tibet from 1944 to 1951. Harrier was on an expedition to climb Nanga Parbat in present-day Pakistan. He got injured during the climb, his team failed to summit, and he was taken prisoner by the British. He then escaped into Tibet and became a friend and teacher of the 14th Dalai Lama. The book was published in 1952. Readers were enchanted and it instantly became a bestseller. Yet, it took the book over 40 years to make it to the silver screen, directed by Jean-Jacques Arnaud. The musical score was played by Ma Yo-Yo, Chinese, French national. Now, before the movie was shown, the author of Virtual Tibet traveled to Austria to interview the author of 7 Years in Tibet. Harrier remembered Tibet fondly, but feels that there is too much pretense in the way that some Western celebrities relate to it. And here's a video of the reunion between the Dalai Lama and Heinrich Harrier.
We spent 7 years there. We were so happy, and it was the best time of our life. And then who would have thought that of all places in the world, you would have to escape again. First I escaped from prison camp, then I have to escape from Tibet. So I had to go again. And nowadays, now you had to leave the country too, and I'm so fortunate now that I can give a little bit back, you know, that what the Tibetans have given me while I was there, and it became one of you. So it's not only a duty, but it's a great joy for me to do something. Now, the year of Tibet, I think we have done a lot, and I look forward to be in Vienna when we have another chance to get support for your country and for your people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The movie was a huge success, scoring 131 million in the box office. While the movie was being shot, the author of Virtual Tibet traveled to Argentina to give us an insider's view on the set. Now, interestingly, the author pointed out that the barrier to entry into the filming location was even higher than that in the real Tibet. He managed to interview director Arno, who recognized the commercial value of Tibet. It captures the imagination of so many Westerners because it represents the most extreme alternative way to restructure Western society. In the minds of these self-loathing romantics, Western society is broken. He also interviewed scriptwriter Becky Johnston, who admitted that she and other Westerners had a need to idealize Tibet as an ancient secret of an earthly paradise where human goodness has been fully realized. Miss Johnston added 2 imaginary scenes into the movie for dramatic effect. One was the scene of PLA soldiers blowing up houses, and the other was a scene of a young Lama being forced by Chinese soldiers to shoot his teacher. Now, these things actually happened, but not within the time frame of Harris' 7 years in Tibet. It was decades later, during the Cultural Revolution, that these things happened. Now, the cast shooting on location in Argentina was multinational. Some, however, like the Lama who was shot by his student in the movie, was a real Lama who had witnessed Chinese atrocities. Passionate about her work, Miss Becky Johnston studies and research on Tibet made her change her religion from being Protestant to being Buddhist. But after seeing the real Tibet for herself, she is compelled to treat the culture as something that she could never be part of. She thinks that America's obsession with Tibet has to do with the fact that they live in a jaded non-culture, leading to a lust for new values. Ironically, the old Tibet was not a free and open society. The majority of Tibet's trespassers 2 to 3 centuries ago were British. Now, the mystical attraction of the rooftop of the world would prove irresistible to them. Everyone wanted to write his own story about this mysterious land. Even though the early explorers wrote quite truthfully about Tibet's hostility, banditry, and even barbaric practices, more and more tried to sneak in. In some cases, curiosity killed them. Some of the first Westerners to enter and anchor themselves in Tibet were Catholic missionaries. Catholic priests who visited Tibet in the 17th century described ordinary Tibetans as uncouth, primitive people who ate raw meat and never washed their hands and faces. They also observed that Tibetan society was extremely unequal, with religious leaders being highly privileged and worshipped like idols. European Catholics had tried very hard to establish a presence in Tibet, but they failed. The records made by these Westerners were raw and unembellished, not very flattering as well. Italian priest Father Desideri described today's popular pilgrimage spot of Mount Kailash as a mountain covered in snow and ice, horrible, barren, steep, and bitterly cold. In the late 18th century, Europeans started to appreciate the beauty of the steep, bitterly cold and barren Himalayas. A new sport was born, mountaineering. Towards the end of the 19th century, the British of India became suspicious of the intentions of the Russian Empire. They figured that if Russia controlled Tibet after subjugating Central Asia, India would be under threat. The British wanted to be assured of neutrality on the part of Tibet. However, letters written to the 13th Dalai Lama were returned unopened. This triggered the military expedition led by Colonel Francis Younghusband, with a strength of 1,000 Sikh and Gurkha troops supported by a battery of the Royal Artillery. British journalists were also on the ground to report on the expedition to the rest of the world. When the fight finally started with devastating results, the Tibetans realized that their magical powers and divine protection from the amulets blessed by lamas had failed them. After facing some resistance from poorly armed and organized Tibetans, Younghusband's troops marched into Lhasa, giving the accompanying British journalists the opportunity to report on the mysteries of this secretive and mystical place. Ironically, the British journals and reports could have been written by a Chinese invader. Tibet didn't just have opulent buildings, it also had squalid quarters with many malnourished people living in poor health and abject poverty. Younghusband and some journalists on the ground described the system of governance as backward and corrupt. Some years later, an explorer by the name of William McGovern nearly lost his life after sneaking into Tibet. He wrote that there is no country which appears so bleak and dreary as the lifeless plains of Tibet. He also wrote that Tibetans were appallingly ignorant people. Supporting that view was a book entitled An Explorer's Adventures in Tibet by Arnold Henry Savage Landor. The book was published in 1910. Now, this book portrayed Tibetans as savages. Now, these condescending reports were quickly cast to the wind when James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon was published in 1933. This was followed by a 1937 movie based on the book. A resplendent Tibet began to replace the savage Tibet and dominate Western minds. The fictional Shangri-La became closely associated with a fascinating and mysterious Tibet. 7 years in Tibet's set designer Huang Tang-at opined that Westerners have gone through so many crises that they feel the need to look for a new religion and spirit. For the movie, Huang had done a lot of research on Tibet, and as a Vietnamese, he could feel for the Tibetan diaspora. His recreation of the Jokang Temple in Argentina brought tears to the eyes of many Tibetans. 7 years in Tibet showed the final face of an authentic Tibet before the Chinese transformed Lhasa into a modern city. One of the most prominent friends of Tibet is Richard Gere, who has always been interested in political causes. He is also one of the most famous Buddhist celebrity in the West. As chairman of the Campaign for Tibet in Washington, he has a close relationship with the Dalai Lama. Indeed, Gere is probably the Western celebrity who can best personify Hollywood's fascination with Tibet. During the 1993 Academy Awards, he startled the audience by protesting against China's occupation of Tibet. Gere's interest in Tibetan spiritualism began as early as the 1970s. He practiced meditation and read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He has also co-founded Tibet House in the US. It's a library, museum, and art gallery set up for the purpose of public education and preserving Tibetan culture. Despite his political views, Gere has a very down-to-earth approach to Tibet and Tibetans. He believes that the movies that Hollywood puts out cannot tell people all they need to know. Another prominent friend of Tibet is director Oliver Stone, who was introduced to Buddhism while filming Heaven and Earth in Vietnam. Now, the story inspired him to go on a pilgrimage to learn more about Buddhism. Upon his return, he teamed up with his spiritual teacher, Tibetan exile Kusum Lingpa, to set up a Dharma center in LA. Stone continued to make political films, but he had ever since toned down on violence and apocalyptic scenes. Now, the most dubious and controversial fan of Tibetan Buddhism is perhaps Steven Seagal, known to Hollywood as a martial arts expert, an actor, a director. Seagal has a string of shallow action and adventure films under his belt. Interested in Aikido when he was young, Seagal moved to Japan, but later abandoned his Japanese wife and son to seek his fortune in Hollywood. Now, his skill in martial arts brought him fame and fortune, but his ambition and personality were highly questionable. To gain fans and fame, he approached Oliver Stone's teacher, Kusum Lingpa, to declare him a tulku, or the reincarnation of a lama. Now, after meeting the Dalai Lama, he claimed that His Holiness kissed his feet. Now, to keep up with the trends, Seagal incorporated Buddhism into his movies. When interviewed by the author of this book, he claimed that he had secretly healed many Tibetan exiles over the years. He boasted that he could shoot a movie on Tibet on location in Ladakh because he had more influence than Arno and Kundun director Martin Scorsese. Now, Seagal would later have his wish granted, identified as a tulku by Peno Rinpoche, but that movie which he talked about was never made. Of course, few people in touch with Buddhism would agree that Seagal demonstrated any elevated spiritual wisdom. Now, taking advantage of the lack of accreditation process in the West, some Westerners could claim enlightenment and qualify themselves as gurus teaching Tibetan wisdom. Not mentioned in this book, Virtual Tibet, is that even the Chinese had tapped the market for Tibetan things. In 1995, Chinese New Age musician Dadawa, a bit like China's Kitaro, made an album entitled Gu, or Sister Drum. The music video was shot on the stunning Tibetan landscape, featuring the daily life of nomads. That album sold 3 million copies worldwide. Now, the thing is, the lyrics of the song were in Chinese, and Dadawa's real name is Zhu Zheqin. She's Han Chinese, dressed up for the role. Now, the Chinese authorities also saw the commercial value of Shangri-La, so much so that they renamed a hamlet in Yunnan near the Tibet border Shangri-La and built an airport nearby. Tourists began to arrive in droves. They thought that Tibet was backward, but there's money to be made selling that image. The irony, the contradictions, and the ambivalence apply on so many levels. When the author finally had the opportunity to interview Brad Pitt and asked him for his opinion after interacting with so many Tibetan exiles on the set, Pitt gave an underwhelming reply saying that he was no historian or politician and was never a victim. In other words, no comment. It was just a job for Brad Pitt. He wasn't fascinated in any way. Now, today's Tibetans are a far cry from Henrik Herrer's Tibet in the 1940s. The exiles, at least, are turning outwards, eagerly interacting with foreigners and making their plight known to the world. Tibet today evokes images of peace, tranquility, wisdom and hospitality. We are often touched by the kindness and niceness of Tibetan communities in Nepal and India. Now, this thought-provoking book makes us wonder if the Tibetan psyche that we are so familiar with today is really an alloy that is beaten to its present shape and form through interaction with the Western world. The West, in turn, is entranced by this interaction, even though in its original form reported by the early explorers, the Tibetan psyche is unlikely to appeal to many foreigners. Today, the wholesome and compassionate image of the Dalai Lama is extremely popular in the West. Within seconds of an Instagram post, there could be tens of thousands of likes. His Holiness speeches draw many superstars and celebrities. Some of these celebrities capitalize on their relationship with His Holiness to promote themselves. Some religious Tibetan exiles have become divas or celebrities in their own right. Some have even let fame and fortune get to their heads. Sadly, gullible, undiscerning fans have fallen victim. After the release and success of 7 Years in Tibet, the Chinese authorities were understandably not pleased at all. They pointed to Harris' Nazi past and claimed that the Dalai Lama's former teacher was a Nazi. They then made a movie of the young husband expedition. Unlike Hollywood, China was able to shoot the movie in the real Tibet in the year 1997. Now, the movie, however, was fictional and pure propaganda. It's called Red River Valley, and the intelligence-insulting message conveyed by the cardboard characters is, Westerners are the real enemies of the Tibetan people. But at the turn of the 21st century, things started to change. China was not only able to censor its own films, it was able to censor foreign films by threatening bans and trade sanctions. By then, Hollywood realized that the bulk of their profits came from overseas. The second big-budget film on Tibet is Kundun, a Martin Scorsese film. It tells the life of the Dalai Lama from his birth until his escape into India. Unable to get permission to shoot anywhere in the Himalayas, this film was shot in Morocco. Kundun is like an enactment of historical events, and it made no attempt to hide the fact that Tibetan society was a feudal, theocratic society with oppressed peasants and corrupt monks. Monks had guns and women, and the spiritual leader was a curious and mischievous boy, just like any other. Unlike 7 Years in Tibet, Kundun was made on a budget of 28 million, but grossed less than 6 million in the box office. There were no Western faces, no Western viewpoint. Perhaps that's why the movie failed to romanticize Tibet and capture the imagination of Tibet lovers. The author's original copy of 7 Years in Tibet featured the Dalai Lama and the other monks on the cover. The new edition featured Brad Pitt. The success of 7 Years and the failure of Kundun reveal an uncomfortable reality. China has occupied Tibet, and so has Hollywood.